What would happen if on your wedding night you discovered your wife was hiding a devastating secret? The millionaire touched her tenderly, thinking she was pure and innocent, but she was concealing a truth that would change everything forever. Tell us, where are you watching from? If this story is captivating you, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button for more romances that will make your heart race. In the perfumed twilight of the bridal chamber, while orange blossom petals scattered across fine Egyptian cotton sheets exhaled their sweet, intoxicating aroma, Eleanor remained motionless as a marble statue when Maxwell approached. What had begun as a simple arranged marriage between traditional families in Napa Valley's wine country would transform into a tapestry of lies, ancestral secrets, and discoveries that would shake not only two lives, but an entire empire built on fragile foundations. Sometimes the greatest lies are those we tell ourselves, she thought, watching the dancing shadows cast by flickering candle flames on walls adorned with antique silk. Eleanor had spoken only a few words during the ceremony held that morning in the estate's private chapel. Her wedding dress, inherited from her grandmother, seemed to carry the weight of generations of women who had accepted their fate without protest. But behind her amber eyes lurked a determination that no one had yet suspected. Maxwell, a 45-year-old man whose graying temples contrasted with eyes still youthful and piercing as a hawk's, approached her with quiet confidence. He believed he had married an orphaned, illiterate farm girl from the rural villages near St. Helena, chosen for her quiet beauty and apparent submissiveness. "You needn't be afraid," he said, in a voice intended to be reassuring as he placed his hand on her shoulder. "I'll be a good husband." She turned her face toward him, letting the candlelight sculpt her delicate features. A slight smile formed on her lips, as enigmatic as the Mona Lisa's. "I know," she replied simply, meeting his gaze, "and I will be much more than you imagine." He took this phrase as a promise of a devoted wife. He did not yet know it was a warning. Harrington Estate awakened each morning to an immutable ritual that seemed to defy time. Eleanor quickly learned to navigate this world of etiquette and centuries-old traditions. During the first few weeks, Maxwell treated her with condescending kindness, patiently explaining the rules of the house, the mealtimes served on fine Lenox china, and the social expectations of a wife of her position. "A woman of your new station must learn to conduct herself in society," explained the housekeeper, Mrs. Winters correcting her posture as she practiced pouring tea into cups so fine one could see light through them. Eleanor nodded docilely, memorizing each lesson, each piece of advice, each nuance of the protocol that governed this new life. But at night, alone in her room, for Maxwell had not insisted on sharing her bed after their first night together, she would take out a small worn leather notebook from its hiding place beneath a floorboard and record her observations about the estate's operations. One summer morning, as the sun caressed the vineyard stretching as far as the eye could see, Maxwell invited her to accompany him on a tour of the grounds. He was proud of his heritage and spoke passionately about each plot, each grape variety, each technique passed down through generations. "These Cabernet Sauvignon vines are over 100 years old," he explained, caressing a leaf between his fingers. "They survived phylloxera thanks to my great-grandfather's foresight." Eleanor carefully observed the landscape, her eyes lingering on the gently rolling hills, on the perfectly aligned rows of vines that seemed to form a green sea under the light breeze. "These vines appear to have been replanted about 20 years ago," she said in an innocent voice. "They don't have the structure of 100-year-old stock." Maxwell froze, his gaze hardening imperceptibly. "How would a farmer's daughter know such a thing?" he asked, his light tone contrasting with the sudden tension in his shoulders. Eleanor lowered her eyes, feigning confusion. "I must be mistaken, forgive me. I heard the vineyard workers talking about it yesterday while I was walking." He seemed to accept this explanation, but a first crack had appeared in the mask she had so carefully constructed. That evening she noticed that he watched her more closely during dinner, his eyes following every movement of her hands as she manipulated silver cutlery with an ease that betrayed an upbringing far different from that of a simple farm girl. Autumn painted Napa Valley vineyards gold and crimson when the first real confrontation took place. A group of British importers had come to visit the estate, and Maxwell had asked Eleanor to remain discreet, to play the role of the reserved wife who simply smiled and nodded. The evening unfolded in the great hall, whose arched windows offered a spectacular view of the vineyards bathed in the golden light of sunset. The men discussed business, cigars in hand, glasses of brandy gleaming amber in the soft light of crystal chandeliers. "These Japanese don't understand the finesse of our wines," said one of the guests, a corpulent man whose flushed face betrayed his excessive consumption. "They want to buy everything, but do they really know how to appreciate a fine Napa Cabernet?" Eleanor, who was silently serving coffee in fine bone china cups, paused briefly. "The Japanese have a word, umami, which designates the fifth fundamental taste," she said softly but distinctly. "Their gustatory palate is extremely developed, particularly for the subtle notes found in Napa Valley wines. That's why they're willing to pay the price for quality." A stunned silence fell over the room. Maxwell stared at her with a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. The British importer, however, seemed genuinely interested. "That's fascinating," he said, turning to her. "And how do you know this, madam?" Before she could answer, Maxwell intervened with a forced laugh. "My wife has an overactive imagination, and sometimes repeats things she hears without understanding them. Eleanor, why don't you go see if dessert is ready?" She bowed slightly, but her eyes met Maxwell's with an assurance that destabilized him. That night, for the first time since their marriage, he came knocking at her bedroom door. "Who are you, really?" he asked without preamble, standing in the doorway, his face partially in shadow. Eleanor was sitting at her dressing table, brushing her long chestnut hair with measured strokes. She looked at him through the mirror. "I'm your wife, as you know." "That's not what I'm asking," he insisted, coming closer. "No farm girl talks about the concept of umami or recognizes the age of vines at first glance. You are not who you pretend to be." An enigmatic smile floated on Eleanor's lips. "We all have our secrets, don't we, Maxwell? Like those vines you claim are centenarian, but which were replanted after being acquired under particular circumstances." Maxwell's face paled, and for the first time she saw worry in his eyes. "What exactly do you know?" "Not as much as I would like," she answered, rising to face him. "But I'm patient, and I learn quickly." October nights brought a coolness that made fires crackle in the estate's fireplaces. But it wasn't the warmth that drove Eleanor to slip out of her room long after the last servant had retired. Dressed in a simple silk robe, she moved like a shadow along corridors adorned with portraits representing the ancestors of the Harrington family, or at least those who were passed off as such. The library had become her refuge and her field of investigation. The leather-bound books, some so old that their yellowed pages threatened to turn to dust beneath her fingers, contained the history of the region. But it was the family registers and ledgers that particularly interested her. That night, as she leafed through a work on the lineages of the great wine families of Napa Valley, the door opened silently. She didn't have time to hide what she was doing. "I was looking for you," said Maxwell, standing in the doorway, a candle in his hand. The flickering light cast moving shadows on his face, features accentuated by concentration. Eleanor didn't try to apologize or hide. She slowly closed the book and looked him straight in the eyes. "And you found me." He came closer, set his candle on the table and examined the book she had just closed. "Genealogies and Alliances of Wine Families of California," he read aloud. A very particular reading for a young woman supposedly from a modest background. "History has always fascinated me," she replied simply. Maxwell pulled up a chair and sat across from her, studying her with a new intensity. She noticed he wore a simple nightshirt and a burgundy velvet robe, his hair slightly tousled from sleep. "You can read, and not just read, but understand complex texts in archaic English and probably Latin. You know viticulture better than some of my managers. Your posture, your way of expressing yourself, everything about you betrays a refined education." He paused, his fingers lightly drumming on the book's cover. "The question is no longer whether you're lying to me, but why." Eleanor sensed this moment was crucial. She could continue to play a role that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, or she could choose a partial truth that would satisfy his curiosity without revealing her true objective. "I was raised in a convent," she finally said. "The sisters educated me far beyond what was usual for an orphan. But when your family requested my hand, I feared you would reject me if you knew I was an educated woman. Men often prefer malleable wives." Maxwell observed her at length, weighing her words. "It's a convincing explanation," he admitted, but incomplete. Why this particular interest in the history of my family and this estate? Isn't it natural that I would want to know the history of the house that is now mine? She replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A flash of doubt crossed Maxwell's gaze, but he nodded slowly. Very well, we'll resume this conversation another time, it's late. He rose, retrieved his candle, but before leaving, he leaned toward her. Know this, Eleanor. Whatever you're searching for, whatever you hope to find, this estate is my life. I will protect it by any means necessary. It was as much a promise as a threat, and Eleanor knew it. When the door closed behind him, she slowly reopened the book to the page she had been studying, the family tree of the Blackwoods, whose last heiress had mysteriously disappeared 20 years earlier, shortly after their wine lands had passed into the hands of the Harringtons. Winter descended upon Napa Valley, transforming the vineyards into an austere landscape where bare vine stalks stood like silent sentinels beneath a steel-grey sky. In the estate house, the atmosphere had considerably cooled between Maxwell and Eleanor. He watched her constantly, and she knew he had begun to research her past. Letters regularly departed for different regions, and responses arrived, all read by Maxwell in the secrecy of his study. But Eleanor had made a discovery that changed everything. In a rarely visited part of the wine cellars, behind a bottle rack that rotated on invisible hinges, she had found a secret room. Inside, trunks containing ancient documents, diaries, and correspondence that told a story quite different from the one the Harrington family had propagated. One stormy evening, while the wind howled around the mansion like a tormented soul, Eleanor had locked herself in her room to study the documents she had carefully copied. The story unfolding before her eyes confirmed her darkest suspicions. The Blackwood family, of which she was the sole heir, had been the victim of a scheme orchestrated by Maxwell's father. Fabricated debts, bought witnesses, corrupt judges, an entire system designed to seize their lands, among the most prestigious in the region. Her mother, pregnant with her at the time, had fled and found refuge with a modest family of vineyard workers who had taken her in. She had died giving birth to her, but before passing had confided her story to these simple people who had sworn to protect the child and reveal the truth when the time was right. Eleanor had grown up knowing who she truly was, secretly educated by a tutor paid with jewelry her mother had carried in her flight. And now, after years of preparation, she had returned to reclaim what legitimately belonged to her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Maxwell, his face grave, a letter in hand. "May I come in?" he asked, with a formal politeness that boded nothing good. She quickly placed the documents under her pillow and gestured for him to sit. "I've received a response from the Mother Superior of St. Anne's Convent," he said, waving the letter. "A convent that, according to you, raised and educated you." Eleanor felt her heart accelerate, but her face remained impassive. And it turns out that no orphan named Eleanor has ever stayed there. In fact, this convent hasn't accepted orphans for more than 50 years. He placed the letter on the table and looked at her intently. "It's time to stop this game, whoever you are. I want the truth now." Eleanor knew this moment would come sooner or later. She stood, went to the window, and observed for a moment the storm raging outside, a perfect reflection of the turmoil agitating her soul. "The truth," she said, turning slowly, "is that I am exactly where I should be. In the house that belonged to my family before yours stole it through means that justice would consider criminal if it became known." Maxwell rose abruptly, his face suddenly pale. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that my name is Eleanor Blackwood, only daughter of Claire and Henry Blackwood, legitimate owners of these lands before they were stolen by your father through a series of maneuvers as dishonest as they were skillful." She pulled from under her pillow the documents she had collected and threw them onto the bed. "Here's the proof. Copies, of course. The originals are safe, ready to be presented to the authorities if necessary." Maxwell slowly approached the bed, took the documents with a trembling hand, and began to scan them. As he read, his face went from incredulity to anger, then to a form of horrified resignation. "If what you say is true, Kat," he began. "It is the truth," she interrupted him firmly, "and now we must decide what happens next." The days following this revelation were as tense as a silk thread about to break. Maxwell had retreated to his study, spending hours verifying the documents Eleanor had shown him. having his lawyer come for long consultations behind closed doors. Eleanor, for her part, continued to play the role of wife for the estate's staff, but she knew the status quo could not last forever. One afternoon, as the first signs of spring began to manifest in buds appearing timidly on the vines, Maxwell summoned her to his study. The room, austere and masculine, with walls covered in books and dark wood furniture, reflected the personality of its occupant. "Please, sit down," he said, indicating a leather armchair facing his imposing oak desk. She obeyed, crossing her hands on her knees in a posture that betrayed more confidence than submission. "I've verified your allegations," he began, pulling a thick file from a drawer. "And while I still refuse to believe that my father could have orchestrated such a misappropriation, I must admit that some elements are troubling." He opened the file and extracted several documents, which he spread on the desk. "However, even if what you claim were true, and I'm not saying it is, the legal statute of limitations passed long ago, and as a legally subservient wife under California law, all your properties, including those you might claim, now belong to me." Eleanor smiled, a smile that had nothing friendly about it. "That's where you're wrong, Maxwell. The statute of limitations doesn't apply in cases of fraud, which these documents clearly demonstrate. As for my status as a wife," she extracted from her bodice another document which she gently placed on the desk. "This is an advance recognition of my rights, signed by a notary in San Francisco before our marriage. It clearly stipulates that any property that might be returned to me following a legal proceeding would remain my exclusive property." Maxwell took the document, examined it carefully, then looked up at her with a mixture of anger and reluctant admiration. "You had planned everything from the beginning." "Not everything," she admitted. "I didn't expect to—" She stopped, suddenly appearing vulnerable for the first time. "What?" he insisted. "To find you different from your father. To see in you a man who, despite his flaws, possesses a sense of honor that your father evidently did not have." This confession seemed to destabilize Maxwell, who stood and went to pour himself a glass of brandy from a small bar set up in a corner of the room. He poured a second and offered it to Eleanor, who accepted with a nod. "What do you want exactly, Eleanor Blackwood?" he finally asked. "To recover these lands? To see me ruined and humiliated? What do you hope to achieve?" She slowly swirled the brandy in her glass, observing the golden reflections of the liquid in the lamplight. "I want the truth. I want justice to be done. But I don't necessarily desire your ruin." She raised her eyes to him, and her gaze was imbued with an emotion she hadn't anticipated. "I propose an alliance, Maxwell. You publicly recognize my Blackwood inheritance. We legally merge our rights to these lands, and we run this estate together, which, after all, would benefit from both our expertise." It was a surprising offer, and Maxwell considered it at length in silence, sipping his brandy. "And if I refuse? Then I'll pursue this matter in court. The courts are less corrupt than in your father's time, and public opinion would not much appreciate the story of an orphan dispossessed of her inheritance by a powerful family." She didn't need to elaborate further. They both knew that a scandal of such magnitude would destroy the estate's reputation, even if legally Maxwell managed to retain the lands. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course, take the time you need. But know that my patience has limits." She rose to leave, but before exiting the room she turned to him. "One last thing, Maxwell. Why did you marry me? You could have chosen any woman from California high society. Why a supposed orphaned farm girl?" Maxwell's gaze darkened, and for the first time she saw a form of shame in it. "It wasn't my choice. My uncle, my father's brother, insisted it be you. Now I understand why." Spring had fully settled on the hills of Napa Valley, transforming the vineyards into an ocean of tender green. But inside Harrington Estate, the atmosphere remained glacial. Maxwell had disappeared for several days, leaving without explanation. Leaving Eleanor alone with her questions and doubts, she had taken advantage of this absence to further explore the family archives, seeking to understand the role of Maxwell's uncle in this whole story. It was in a diary hidden in a dusty trunk in the attic that she found clues to another dimension of the plot. The diary belonged to Maxwell's mother, who had died several years earlier. Through cryptic entries and veiled allusions, the truth emerged. Maxwell's uncle, Gideon Harrington, had been the true architect of the Blackwoods' ruin, manipulating his own brother, a man of weaker character, into taking actions that would lead to the seizure of the lands. But the reason behind this machination was far more personal than ambition or greed. Gideon had once been in love with Claire Blackwood, Eleanor's mother, who had rejected him to marry Henry. A cold, calculated revenge spanning decades. Maxwell's return on a rainy evening interrupted her research. He found her in the library, surrounded by scattered documents. "I saw my uncle," he announced, without preamble, his face grave and clothes still damp with rain. Eleanor rose slowly, clutching against her the diary she had just deciphered. "And?" He didn't deny it, not really. He spoke of necessary decisions and protection of the family heritage. Maxwell seemed aged by 10 years, his shoulders bent under the weight of revelations. "It wasn't for the heritage," Eleanor said softly, handing him the diary. "It was to avenge himself on my mother, who had refused his advances. Your uncle is a dangerous man, guided by a grudge that has poisoned several lives." Maxwell took the diary with a hesitant hand, as if he feared what he would discover. "I no longer know whom to believe, or what to believe," he murmured, dropping into an armchair. Eleanor approached him, touched despite herself by his evident distress. "Believe the facts. Believe the documents. Believe what your heart tells you is right." He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw in him an authentic vulnerability. "My uncle told me something else. He told me that our marriage was not a coincidence, that he had deliberately arranged things so that I would marry the Blackwood daughter, in the hope that your status as a legally subservient wife would definitively seal the transfer of lands to our family." Eleanor felt a wave of anger rise within her. "I was just a pawn in his game, as you were in mine. We were both manipulated, Maxwell." He nodded slowly, then suddenly stood, a new resolution in his gaze. "Then perhaps it's time we stopped being pawns and started playing our own game." He approached her, took her hands in his. "Your alliance proposal, I accept it, but not just for the lands or to avoid a scandal. I want to do what's right, Eleanor. And perhaps together we can heal the wounds our families have inflicted on each other." It was a sincere declaration, and Eleanor felt something soften within her. But she also knew that the path to true reconciliation would be long and strewn with obstacles. "There's still much to do," she said cautiously. "Your uncle won't easily accept this alliance." "My uncle will have no say in the matter," Maxwell replied with a firmness that surprised her. "These lands are legally mine, even if morally they should be yours. Together we can establish a new beginning, based on honesty and mutual respect." He hesitated a moment, then added more softly, "And perhaps with time, something more." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. The conflicting feelings that had inhabited her for months, anger, mistrust, but also a reluctant admiration for this man who was not what she had imagined, made her vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. "One step at a time, Maxwell," she finally said. "Let's start with truth and justice. The rest may come with time." Summer descended on Napa Valley with a relentless heat that seemed to reflect the intensity of events unfolding at Harrington Estate. The fragile alliance between Maxwell and Eleanor was quickly put to the test when Gideon Harrington, Maxwell's uncle, arrived at the estate without warning, accompanied by his lawyer. The confrontation took place in the Great Hall, where the portraits of ancestors seemed to observe the scene with morbid curiosity. Gideon, an elegant man in his 60s, whose sharp gaze betrayed a cold intelligence, wasted no time on pleasantries. "You've lost your mind, Maxwell," he exclaimed, throwing onto the coffee table a folder containing preliminary documents that Eleanor and Maxwell had begun to prepare. Recognizing this schemer as the legitimate heir of the Blackwoods, ceding her half of our heritage, have you thought about what your father would say?" Maxwell, who stood near the unlit fireplace, did not let himself be intimidated. "My father should have thought about the consequences of his actions. What you did to the Blackwoods was unjust, illegal, and morally reprehensible." Gideon turned to Eleanor, who was sitting calmly in a Queen Anne chair, dressed in a simple but elegant dress that accentuated her natural dignity. "And you," he hissed, "do you really think you can arrive here with your claims and your dubious documents and change everything? These lands have been Harrington lands for more than 20 years. The legal statute of limitations passed long ago." Eleanor smiled slightly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The statute of limitations doesn't apply in cases of fraud, Mr. Harrington. and I have sufficient evidence to demonstrate not only the fraud, but also your personal involvement in it. Evidence that I'm certain would greatly interest certain journalists, not to mention the authorities." Gideon's lawyer cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Harrington, it might be wise to consider an amicable agreement. The documents I've been able to examine summarily seem disturbing." Gideon glared at his lawyer, then turned to Maxwell, abruptly changing tactics. "You don't understand what's at stake. It's not just a matter of land or money. It's our name, our legacy, our place in California society. If this story breaks, we'll be ruined, not just financially, but socially." "Then it's up to you to decide," Eleanor intervened. "Do you accept our alliance proposal, which would at least preserve appearances and the estate's reputation? Or do you prefer to risk a public scandal that would destroy everything you claim to want to protect?" The old man suddenly seemed aged by 10 years, his arrogance giving way to a form of calculating despair. "What do you want exactly?" he finally asked. "Public recognition of my Blackwood inheritance, a legal restructuring of the estate that reflects this reality, and—" she looked at Maxwell, who nodded imperceptibly. "And your complete withdrawal from the estate's affairs. You will retain a generous pension, but you will no longer have any decision-making power over Harrington Estate." Gideon burst into a joyless laugh. "You're asking me to cut off my right hand. I'm asking you to pay for your crimes in a way that will allow you to preserve your freedom and part of your dignity," she replied firmly. The tension in the room was palpable. Maxwell approached Eleanor and stood by her side, a symbolic gesture that didn't escape Gideon. "I see," he said with a bitter smile. "My nephew has not only betrayed his family, but has fallen under the charm of the enemy. How poetic." He rose slowly, adjusted his impeccably tailored tweed jacket. "You haven't won this war yet, Miss Blackwood. I still have a few cards to play." With these words, he left the room, followed by his visibly uncomfortable lawyer. When the door closed behind them, Eleanor let out a long sigh. "He won't give up easily," she said. Maxwell sat beside her, looking concerned. "No, and that's what worries me. My uncle is a dangerous man when he feels cornered." He took her hand in his, a gesture that now seemed natural despite the extraordinary circumstances of their relationship. "We must be prepared for anything, Eleanor. This confrontation is only the beginning." She squeezed his hand in response, feeling for the first time that they were truly allies against a common threat. "Together, we are stronger," she said simply. But in the secrecy of her heart, she wondered if this alliance born of necessity could survive the storms to come. The weeks following the confrontation with Gideon were strangely calm, like the eye of a hurricane. Too calm, according to Eleanor, who knew the old man wouldn't give up so easily. This waiting made her anxious, and she often found herself startling at the slightest unusual noise or scrutinizing the faces of the servants for signs of betrayal. Maxwell, for his part, seemed to have fully committed to their new alliance. He had begun to show her all aspects of managing the estate, including her in every decision, presenting her to employees and business partners as his equal. This transition had not been without difficulties. Some more traditional vineyard workers found it hard to accept the authority of a woman, and rumors were beginning to circulate in the region about the changes at Harrington Estate. One particularly stifling afternoon, as they returned from a visit to the cellars where oak barrels were aging, Maxwell suddenly stopped in the middle of the vineyards. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent, tinting the sky with shades of orange and purple. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. They had been working so harmoniously during this period that she had almost forgotten the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. "What do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair already tousled by the light breeze. "All of this alliance, this reconfiguration of the estate, is it really what you want, Eleanor? Or is it simply a stage in a larger plan whose details I don't yet know?" His question caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because she herself had begun to ask the same questions. Her feelings toward Maxwell had transformed in a way she hadn't anticipated. The initial animosity had given way to reluctant respect, then to something more complex, more troubling. "I no longer know what I want," she finally admitted. "For years I've lived with a single objective, to reclaim what belonged to my family. Now that this objective is within reach, I wonder if it's really what will make me happy. Maxwell moved closer to her, hesitant as if he feared crossing an invisible line. And what would make you happy, Eleanor Blackwood? She looked up at him, feeling a vulnerability she had always forbidden herself. I don't know, maybe simply the truth, recognition of who I truly am, and she broke off, unable to express the conflicting feelings that inhabited her. Maxwell waited patiently, and in his gaze she saw an understanding that touched her deeply, and perhaps something that neither you nor I had anticipated in our carefully crafted plans, he completed softly. He extended a hesitant hand toward her face, brushed her cheek with a caress so light she might have imagined it. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by an emotion her heart had not allowed itself to recognize until now. The moment was interrupted by the precipitous arrival of the estate manager, Preston Davis, a usually composed man who now seemed deeply troubled. "Sir, madam," he said, breathless from running, "you must return to the estate immediately. Court officers have arrived with legal documents. They say that—" He hesitated, casting a worried glance toward Eleanor. "They say that Madam is accused of fraud and identity theft. They have a warrant to seize all her personal documents." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. This was Gideon's counterattack, and she should have predicted it. "What documents are they presenting exactly?" asked Maxwell, his calm tone contrasting with the evident tension in his body. "A thick file, sir. It seems to contain testimonies claiming that Madam is not who she claims to be, that she has fabricated documents to pass herself off as the Blackwood heir." Maxwell turned to Eleanor, and she saw in his eyes a silent question, a request for confirmation that all this was just another manipulation by his uncle. "I am Eleanor Blackwood," she affirmed with quiet conviction. "The documents I presented are authentic. Your uncle is simply trying to buy time and sow doubt." But even to her own ears, her voice seemed less assured than she would have liked. The weeks spent with Maxwell, the bond that had formed between them, had shaken her initial determination. She was no longer simply the cold, calculating avenger come to reclaim her due. She had become a woman, torn between justice and feelings she hadn't anticipated in her plan. Maxwell seemed to perceive her turmoil, for he firmly took her hand in his. "Let's go back and face this together," he said. "Whatever happens, we'll find a solution." But as they walked quickly toward the mansion, Eleanor couldn't help wondering if their alliance, so promising just minutes ago, could survive this new test. Maxwell's study, usually orderly and serene, now resembled a bureaucratic battlefield. Papers were spread across all available surfaces. Open files revealed ancient documents with time-yellowed handwriting, and two stern-looking court officers waited patiently while Gideon Harrington's lawyer presented his accusations with barely disguised satisfaction. "As you can see," he concluded, adjusting his glasses on his thin nose, "we have testimonies from several people stating that the real Eleanor Blackwood died 15 years ago in an accident in Switzerland. This woman," he pointed an accusing finger at Eleanor, "is an impostor who has elaborated a sophisticated plan to seize your fortune, Mr. Harrington." Maxwell, standing near the window, observed the scene with an apparent calm that contrasted with the emotional storm Eleanor sensed within him. He hadn't released her hand since their return to the estate, as if he feared she might evaporate if the physical contact between them were broken. "These testimonies," he finally said, "who exactly are they from?" The lawyer consulted his notes. "From former servants of the Blackwood family, from a doctor who treated young Eleanor in her childhood, and from a tutor who briefly taught her before her presumed disappearance." Eleanor felt an icy chill run down her spine. These witnesses were well chosen, peripheral enough to be credible, but not close enough to know the whole truth. "And these witnesses," she intervened in a voice she strove to keep steady, "have they been paid for their testimonies?" The lawyer stiffened. "This insinuation is defamatory, madam." "It's not an insinuation, it's a legitimate question," she replied, "as would be asking whether these witnesses have been threatened or intimidated to corroborate a story fabricated by Gideon Harrington." A tense silence settled over the room. One of the court officers cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "In the absence of irrefutable proof of your identity," the lawyer resumed, "we request the immediate seizure of all your personal documents, as well as your expulsion from the estate, until this matter is resolved by the courts." Maxwell finally released Eleanor's hand, but only to position himself in front of her, like a shield. "This request is denied," he said firmly. "The lady is my legitimate wife, whatever her birth name. She will remain here and no document will be seized without a judge's order, which you evidently don't have." The lawyer had a condescending smile. "I understand your position, Mr. Harrington. The attachment you've developed for this person is evident. But be reasonable, evidence is mounting against her. Your uncle only seeks to protect the family heritage." Maxwell slowly approached his desk, opened a drawer, and extracted a small wooden box that Eleanor had never seen before. "My uncle seeks to protect his interests, as he always has," he said, opening the box with a small key he wore around his neck. "And it seems he has forgotten certain documents that my father entrusted to me before his death." He pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed by time, which he handed to the lawyer. "This is a written confession from my father, detailing how my uncle manipulated him to illegally seize the Blackwood lands, motivated by a personal vendetta against Claire Blackwood, who had rejected his advances. It also includes details about how they tried to locate the Blackwood child for years, fearing that one day she would return to claim her inheritance." The lawyer's face visibly paled as he scanned the document. The court officers exchanged embarrassed glances. "This document," the lawyer began, "could be contested." "As could your testimonies," Maxwell interrupted him. "The difference is that I'm ready to go all the way to expose this whole story to the light of day if necessary. Is my uncle prepared to risk not only his reputation, but also criminal prosecution?" The silence that followed was eloquent. The lawyer slowly packed his documents into his briefcase, visibly destabilized. "I must consult my client," he finally said. "This situation requires reassessment." After their departure, Eleanor collapsed into an armchair, emotionally exhausted. Maxwell knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "How long have you had this confession?" she asked softly. "My father gave it to me on his deathbed 3 years ago. He made me promise to open it only in case of absolute necessity. I believe he wanted both to protect himself and to give me a means to defend against my uncle if the situation ever became untenable." He hesitated a moment before adding, "I read it the very evening you revealed your true identity to me. It's what convinced me to believe you, to trust you." Eleanor felt tears she had held back too long rise to her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me? Why go through all these weeks of uncertainty and complicated plans?" Maxwell smiled sadly. "For the same reason you didn't simply present your evidence to the authorities from the beginning, because I wanted to know you, to understand who you really were beyond your quest for justice, because I wanted you to see me as an ally, not just as the son of the man who stole your inheritance." He brought her hands to his lips in a gesture of unexpected tenderness. "And perhaps also because I was beginning to feel something for you that I hadn't anticipated." These words, spoken with a disarming sincerity, shattered the last defenses Eleanor had maintained around her heart. For the first time since the beginning of this adventure, she allowed herself to cry, not from sadness or anger, but from a deep, liberating relief. "What will we do now?" she asked when she could finally speak. "Exactly what we had planned," Maxwell replied with a new confidence. "Rebuild this estate together, honor both the Blackwood legacy and the best of the Harringtons. But perhaps—" He broke off, suddenly hesitant. "Perhaps we could do it not simply as allies of necessity, but as a true couple. If that's what you want too, of course." The question floated between them, charged with hope and new possibilities. Eleanor realized that the vengeance that had animated her for so long had transformed into something far more precious, the chance at a new beginning, a love born from the ashes of an old rivalry. "I believe," she said slowly, "that is indeed what I want." Autumn adorned the Napa Valley vineyards with flaming splendor. Vine leaves tinged ochre, purple and gold beneath the waning September sun. Harvest was in full swing at the Harrington Blackwood estate, a new name for a new beginning, symbolizing the union of two legacies that history had violently separated. Eleanor stood atop a hill, watching the harvesters moving between the rows of vines, their voices and laughter rising toward her like a joyful melody. She wore a simple cotton dress, her hair gathered in a loose braid, and her hands bore the marks of her work. For unlike other landowners, she actively participated in the harvest, wanting to know every aspect of the estate she now ran with Maxwell. "I knew I'd find you here," said a voice behind her. Maxwell approached, holding 2 glasses of wine. He handed her one, his eyes reflecting the golden light of dusk. "The first drawing of last year's vintage. Our first wine together." They toasted silently, savoring this moment of calm amid the harvest's effervescence. "Who could have imagined a year ago that we would be here like this?" Eleanor murmured, contemplating the ruby liquid that sparkled in her glass. The months following the confrontation with Gideon's lawyer had been intense. Maxwell's uncle, backed into a corner by his brother's written confession, had finally accepted a compromise. His immediate retirement in exchange for a generous pension and the promise that no proceedings would be brought against him. He had retired to a property on the coast of Maine, far from the lands that had been the object of so much intrigue. The legal restructuring of the estate had been complex, but finally accomplished. An official merger of the Harrington and Blackwood heritages with public recognition of Eleanor's inheritance. Some conservative families in the region had initially greeted this change with skepticism, but the quality of wines produced under their joint direction had progressively silenced the critics. "I believe destiny has a rather developed sense of irony," Maxwell responded, putting an arm around her waist. "An arranged marriage to seal a theft finally becomes the means to repair an injustice and create something new." Eleanor nestled against him, savoring the warmth of his body in the air that cooled with the approach of evening. "We still have much to do," she said, observing the hectares of vineyards stretching before them. "The new biodynamic cultivation techniques we want to introduce, the renovation of the cellars, the expansion of our markets in Asia." Maxwell laughed softly, placing a kiss on her forehead. "Always so ambitious. It's one of the things I love about you." She looked up at him, feeling that familiar warmth spread through her chest each time he pronounced these words. Their relationship had evolved slowly, cautiously, like a precious wine that must mature at its own pace. They had learned to know each other truly, beyond masks and strategies, discovering with surprise how complementary their visions and values were despite their very different origins. "Let's go in," he suggested. "I have a surprise for you." Intrigued, she followed him along the path descending toward the mansion. Twilight now enveloped the landscape in diffuse light, transforming the centuries-old stones of the dwelling into pale gold. Entering the hall, Eleanor immediately noticed something was different. A delicious smell of cooking came from the dining room, and voices she didn't recognize resonated in the drawing room. "What?" she began, but Maxwell placed a finger on her lips, smiling mysteriously. He guided her to the drawing room, and when he opened the doors, Eleanor froze. Standing in the middle of the room was an elderly woman she hadn't seen for more than 15 years, Margaret Dawson, the cook who had cared for her after her mother's death, before she was sent to the convent. "My little Eleanor," murmured the old woman, eyes bright with tears. "You've come home." Beside her stood other familiar faces, former servants of the Blackwood family, vineyard workers who had worked for her father, all those who had known the truth but had been forced into silence for years. "How?" stammered Eleanor, overwhelmed with emotion. "I've spent months looking for them," explained Maxwell. "I wanted to gather all those who could testify to your true identity, all those who had known you as a child. I thought it would be important for you to reconnect with your past. It was a gift of inestimable value, the validation of her identity, the reconnection with roots she had believed forever lost." Eleanor crossed the room and threw herself into Margaret's arms, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender and flower that had cradled her childhood. Then she turned to each face, listening to their stories, their memories of her as a little girl, of her parents, of the estate as it was before. The evening passed like a dream, filled with tales, laughter, and some tears. A feast had been prepared with traditional dishes that Margaret used to cook for the Blackwood family, accompanied by the estate's finest wines. It was as if past and present merged, creating a bridge to a future Eleanor would never have dared imagine when she arrived at the estate with her worn suitcase and heart full of resentment. Late in the night, when the guests had retired to rooms prepared for them, Maxwell found Eleanor in the library. She was holding an old fairy tale book that Margaret had brought back to her, an object from her childhood, miraculously preserved. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing these words were insufficient to express what she felt. Maxwell sat beside her on the sofa, taking her hand in his. "There's one last thing," he said, pulling from his pocket a small antique box of blue velvet. "This belonged to your mother. My father had kept it. perhaps out of remorse. He opened the box, revealing a delicate gold ring topped with a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. "I'm not asking you to accept it as an engagement ring. We're already married after all," he said with a smile. "But perhaps as a symbol of renewal, of what we've built together from the ruins of the past." Eleanor looked at the ring, then at Maxwell, and understood that the cycle of vengeance and pain was finally broken. In its place blossomed something stronger, more lasting, a love born of truth and forgiveness, rooted like a vine in the rich soil of their shared history. Winter descended upon Napa Valley with unusual rigor. Early frosts threatened vines still fragile after a major restructuring of the plots, and Eleanor spent her days coordinating efforts to protect this living heritage. Braziers were lit between the rows during the coldest nights, creating a phantasmagorical spectacle of hundreds of small dancing flames across the hills wrapped in fog. That morning she had gone out at dawn, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, to inspect the night's damage. Maxwell had joined her later, bringing thermoses of hot coffee for exhausted workers who had kept vigil all night. "The forecasts aren't encouraging," he said, handing her a steaming cup. "3 more nights of frost according to the weather service." Eleanor sighed, scanning the horizon where the sun rose lazily, diffusing a pale light through the morning mist. "We'll hold," she affirmed with quiet determination. "These vines have survived far worse over the centuries." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Preston, the estate manager, who was rapidly advancing toward them, his usually placid face marked with concern. "Madam, sir, I'm sorry to disturb you, but an urgent problem requires your attention." He handed them a local newspaper, opened to an inner page where an article spread that made Eleanor freeze. "Scandal in Napa Valley. The mysterious heir of the Blackwoods," she read aloud. The article insinuated that her reappearance and her marriage to Maxwell were the fruit of a manipulation orchestrated by competitors jealous of the Harringtons' success. Anonymous sources questioned the authenticity of documents proving her identity. "Gideon," murmured Maxwell, a cold anger hardening his features. "He hasn't given up." Back at the mansion, they discovered that the article was only the tip of the iceberg. Rumors were circulating throughout the wine region, sowing doubt about the legitimacy of their joint enterprise. Some business partners were beginning to hesitate to renew their contracts, fearing association with a possible scandal. In the study that had become their joint headquarters, Eleanor and Maxwell held a council of war with their lawyer, Attorney Lawrence, a brilliant man who had managed all the legal restructuring of the estate. "These allegations are unfounded," he assured them, scanning the article. "We have irrefutable evidence of your identity, credible witnesses, the written confession of your father." "But the damage is already done," Eleanor interrupted. "Doubt has been sown. And in this traditional environment, reputation is everything." She stood and walked to the window, observing the vineyards stretching as far as the eye could see. These lands for which she had fought so hard now seemed suddenly threatened by a shadow, as intangible but as dangerous as the frost that prowled in the night. "What do you propose?" Maxwell asked the lawyer, his hand instinctively seeking Eleanor's when she returned to sit beside him. "A media counter-offensive," replied Attorney Lawrence. "A press conference where you'll present all the documents proving Madam's legitimacy, accompanied by the witnesses you've gathered. A guided tour of the estate to show the improvements you've made. And above all, a tasting of your new wines to remind everyone of what really matters, the quality of your production." The idea was good, but Eleanor felt something was missing. She knew her uncle-in-law, knew he wouldn't stop there. They needed to strike at the source. "And Gideon?" she asked. "As long as he continues to orchestrate these attacks from the shadows, we'll always be on the defensive." Maxwell exchanged a glance with the lawyer, then turned to her with a resolute expression. "I have an idea, but it's risky, and it will require your direct participation, Eleanor." He explained his plan. Instead of simply defending themselves, they would confront Gideon directly, but not in the way he expected. They would invite him to participate in the press conference, offer him a place at the table, public recognition of his past contribution to the estate, knowing that his refusal or hostile presence would place him in an untenable position. The following week was intense. While they fought against the frost at night, they meticulously prepared their response by day. Eleanor worked tirelessly, supervising both the protection of the vines and the organization of the event that would determine their future. The evening before the press conference, exhausted but determined, she joined Maxwell in their room, for they now shared the same one, their relationship having evolved toward an intimacy neither would have believed possible at the beginning. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he asked softly, drawing her close. She nodded, savoring the warmth and solidity of his embrace. "I've spent my life hiding, preparing my revenge in the shadows. Tomorrow, I'll stand in the light and reclaim my name, my heritage, and our common future." He kissed her tenderly, a hand caressing her cheek with a gentleness that contrasted with the strength of his determination. "You're no longer alone in this battle," he murmured. "And whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together." That night, nestled against Maxwell, Eleanor realized that her quest for justice had transformed into something far more precious. The building of a future where truth and love had more weight than old wounds. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without her last thought being of revenge, but rather of this man who had changed her life in a way she could never have imagined. The next morning, dressed in an elegant suit that united modernity and tradition, Eleanor stood before the great reception hall of the estate, where dozens of journalists, vintners, and important figures of the wine region had gathered. At her side, Maxwell was a pillar of quiet strength, and facing them, seated in the front row with an indecipherable expression, was Gideon Harrington. He had accepted the invitation, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of arrogance, perhaps to attempt to sabotage the event from within. In any case, his presence added a palpable tension to the already electric atmosphere. Eleanor advanced to the podium, her heart beating but her voice steady. "I thank you all for coming today." The reception hall of Harrington Blackwood Estate vibrated with contained energy. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden light on the assembly, where eager journalists, curious vintners, and local notables mingled. Eleanor felt all eyes fixed on her as she stood behind the podium, Maxwell at her side like a reassuring presence. "I thank you all for coming today," she began, her clear voice carrying to the back of the hall. "Many of you have heard rumors, read articles questioning my identity and the legitimacy of my position here. Today I wish to end these speculations by presenting you with the complete truth, without masks and without compromise." She paused, her gaze briefly resting on Gideon Harrington, seated in the front row. His face showed a neutral expression, but his fingers nervously tapping on the armrest of his chair betrayed his anxiety. "I was born Eleanor Blackwood, only daughter of Claire and Henry Blackwood, legitimate owners of these lands until their appropriation by the Harrington family 20 years ago." A murmur ran through the audience. Eleanor extracted a series of documents, which she placed on the podium. "Here is my original birth certificate, authenticated by county archives. Here also are certified testimonies from people who knew me as a child, and who can confirm my identity." She signaled Margaret Dawson and the other former Blackwood employees to stand. They did so with dignity, nodding to the assembly. "But I haven't come today to stir up the past or foment old disputes. I am here to talk about the future." She turned to Maxwell, who took over. "For years, our families were separated by actions I won't hesitate to call unjust. My father, influenced by my Uncle Gideon here present, participated in maneuvers that deprived the Blackwood family of their legitimate inheritance. He, in turn, extracted a document which he showed to the audience. This is my father's written confession, drafted on his deathbed, detailing the circumstances of this appropriation. I've kept it secret until now, hoping that a peaceful resolution could be found without publicly exposing this sad history." Gideon rose abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. This woman has manipulated you, Maxwell, has drawn you away from your family with fantastic stories and forged documents." A tense silence fell over the hall. It was exactly the reaction they had anticipated. "Uncle," Maxwell calmly responded, "your reaction is understandable given your personal involvement in this affair. But let me ask you a simple question. Why did you insist that I marry this particular woman, presented as a simple orphaned farm girl? Wasn't it in the hope that the marriage would definitively legitimize the possession of the Blackwood lands in case the legitimate heir should one day reappear?" Gideon's face crumbled. He looked around like a cornered animal seeking an exit. It's ridiculous," he stammered. Eleanor resumed speaking, her voice imbued with a quiet strength. "Mr. Harrington, we are not here to humiliate you or publicly accuse you. In fact, we wish to thank you." This declaration visibly surprised not only Gideon but the entire assembly. "Without your maneuvers to bring us together, Maxwell and I would never have met. We would never have had the opportunity to heal the wounds of the past and create something new together." Maxwell nodded, picking up the thread. "What we announce today is not an accusation or a division, but a reconciliation and a union. Harrington Blackwood Estate was born from our common decision to recognize the errors of the past while looking to the future. We have legally restructured the property to reflect this new reality, and we invite all those who knew and loved these lands under their previous denominations to celebrate with us this new chapter." Eleanor signaled to a group of waiters who entered, carrying trays of glasses filled with a deep red wine. "We would like you to taste the first cuvée produced under our joint direction, Reconciliation, a wine that we hope will embody this new era." While the glasses were being distributed, Eleanor approached Gideon directly, who seemed frozen in place, uncertain how to react to this unexpected turn of events. She personally handed him a glass, her gaze meeting his without hostility, but with an unwavering firmness. "Your place in the history of this estate is recognized, Mr. Harrington. We hope that you will be able to find in your heart the capacity to accept this new chapter, and perhaps one day, to share with us the pride of what we are building on the common foundations of our families." For a long moment, Gideon remained motionless, his gaze passing from the glass to Eleanor's face, then to that of his nephew. The entire hall held its breath. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, he accepted the glass, a gesture which, without being a complete capitulation, was at least a tacit recognition of the new reality. Maxwell raised his own glass. "To the future of Harrington Blackwood Estate, to the truth that liberates, and to the reconciliation that heals." Glasses clinked throughout the hall, and even Gideon, after a hesitation, brought his to his lips. The wine was exceptional, rich, complex, with deep notes of black fruits and a finish of subtle spices that left a lasting impression. Like a symbol of their union, it had matured under difficult conditions, but had emerged stronger, more character-filled. After the formalities, while guests tasted the wines and toured the exhibition of documents and photographs retracing the intertwined history of the two families, Eleanor and Maxwell found themselves alone for a moment in a quiet corner of the hall. "You were magnificent," he murmured, squeezing her hand in his. She smiled, feeling an enormous weight lift from her shoulders. "We did it. We transformed decades of lies and pain into something true, something beautiful." He brought her hand to his lips, depositing a tender kiss. "This is only the beginning, Eleanor Harrington Blackwood, the beginning of our true story." In that moment, surrounded by the buzz of conversations and the clinking of glasses, with the rich scent of wine floating in the air and the golden light of the setting sun filtering through the tall windows, they knew they had finally found their place, together rooted in this land that had seen so much drama, but which now promised a future of peace and abundance. A year had passed since the press conference that changed the destiny of Harrington Blackwood Estate. Spring had given way to a glorious summer, then to a sumptuous autumn that promised exceptional harvests. The vines, heavy with ripe grapes, undulated beneath the light breeze like a vegetable sea of purple and gold hues. Eleanor stood on the mansion's terrace, observing the feverish activity in the vineyards below. Teams of harvesters moved methodically between the rows, their shears glinting in the sun, as they delicately cut clusters of Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay. Baskets overflowed with succulent fruits that would soon be transformed into a nectar celebrated worldwide. "What are you thinking about?" asked Maxwell, joining her, sliding an arm around her waist. She smiled, nestling against him. "I'm thinking about how surprising life can be. 2 years ago I came here animated by anger and vengeance. Today I find myself in the same place, my heart full of gratitude and hope." The past year had brought profound changes, not only to the estate but to their personal lives. Their relationship, born in extraordinary circumstances, had blossomed into a solid love, rooted in mutual respect and understanding. They had learned to work together, combining Eleanor's expertise in biodynamic viticulture with Maxwell's talent for business and marketing. Harrington Blackwood Estate thrived under their joint direction. The Reconciliation Cuvée had received rave reviews and sold at record prices. Their story, far from being a handicap, had become an integral part of their brand, a tale of redemption and renewal that resonated deeply with wine lovers around the world. Even Gideon Harrington, after months of bitterness and resistance, had begun to accept the new reality. His declining health had perhaps made him more receptive to the idea of resolution and peace before it was too late. During his last visit, he had even complimented a particular wine, a small gesture that represented a giant step toward reconciliation. "Let's go," said Maxwell, taking her hand. "They're waiting for us." They descended together toward the vineyards where a centuries-old tradition was about to be honored. The owners symbolically participated in the harvest, cutting the first clusters that would be used for a special cuvée. This year, the ceremony had a particular significance. The harvesters, accustomed to Eleanor's presence as she often worked alongside them despite her status, respectfully made way. At the center of the group stood Margaret Dawson, now officially integrated into the estate team as the guardian of local culinary traditions. She held 2 pairs of silver shears on a burgundy velvet cushion. "Madam, sir," she said with an affectionate reverence, "the vines are ready." Eleanor took a pair of shears, feeling the weight of the legacy they represented. These same instruments had been used by generations of Blackwoods before her. Maxwell took the other pair, and together they approached a particular vine stock that had been carefully selected for its exposure and the exceptional quality of its fruits. "This vine," Eleanor explained to those gathered, "is one of the oldest on the estate. It has survived phylloxera, 2 world wars, and decades of neglect. Like our family, it has endured, adapted, and continues to produce fruits of extraordinary beauty and complexity." Maxwell nodded, completing her words. "And like this vine that draws its strength from the specific terroir of Napa Valley, we have found our strength in the union of our stories, in the acceptance of our common past, and in our shared vision of the future." Together, they cut a particularly sumptuous cluster, gently placing it in a wicker basket, specially woven for the occasion. The applause and exclamations of joy from the harvesters echoed across the hills, accompanied by the distant sound of the village church bells that seemed to bless this moment. That evening, a long table had been set up in the midst of the vineyards, illuminated by hundreds of lanterns suspended from the vine stalks. All those who worked at the estate, from farm laborers to enologists, were invited to this traditional meal that celebrated the beginning of the harvest. Eleanor and Maxwell took their places at the center of the table. The meal, prepared by Margaret and her team, was a feast of regional specialties: homemade foie gras, lamb confit with herbs, vegetables from the estate's organic garden, aged cheeses from the estate's cellars, and of course wines carefully selected to accompany each dish. As night settled in and joyful conversations mingled with the chirping of crickets, Maxwell rose, holding his glass. Silence gradually fell. "I wish to make a toast," he said, his gaze sweeping over the attentive faces before resting tenderly on Eleanor. "To our first harvest, as a true family." Confused murmurs ran through the assembly. Eleanor looked up at him, a silent question in her gaze. He smiled, extending his hand to invite her to stand beside him. "Eleanor and I have an announcement to make," he continued. "An announcement we've been saving for this special occasion." Eleanor felt her heart accelerate. They had discussed it in private, of course, but making this announcement publicly suddenly made it very real. "Next spring," she said in a clear voice that carried through the gentle night, "Harrington Blackwood Estate will welcome a new heir." Her hand instinctively rested on her stomach, still flat but already bearing the promise of a new life. Exclamations of surprise and joy burst around the table, followed by enthusiastic applause and congratulations. Margaret wiped away a tear of emotion, probably remembering young Claire Blackwood pregnant with Eleanor, who had fled this same estate decades earlier under such different circumstances. The circle was closed, and this time the child would be born in joy and harmony. Later, as the celebration was in full swing, Maxwell led Eleanor aside to a small promontory that offered a panoramic view of the estate, bathed in the silver light of the moon. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, surrounding her face with his hands with infinite tenderness. She looked up at him, her gaze reflecting the stars. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered. "We have transformed a legacy of pain into a promise of future. Our child will be born free from the weight of the past, heir not only to these lands, but to our courage and our capacity to forgive." Maxwell kissed her gently, a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and complicity. "The true legacy isn't in the vines or in the stones of this mansion," he murmured against her lips. "It's in our capacity to choose love rather than vengeance, truth rather than the comfort of lies." Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, contemplating the estate stretching before them. Each plot, each stone, each vine stalk, bearing the traces of a complex but now reconciled history. "Sometimes the greatest lies are those we tell ourselves," she quoted, remembering her thought during their first wedding night. "I lied to myself believing that vengeance would bring me peace, but it's forgiveness that has truly freed me." Maxwell squeezed her hand in his, and together they contemplated their estate that seemed to extend to infinity beneath the starry sky. The vines, silent witnesses to the passage of time, carried within them the promise of seasons to come, of future harvests, of generations that would continue the work begun in pain, but continued in love. Like these centenarian vines, whose roots plunged deeply into the calcareous soil of Napa Valley, their love was now anchored in a hard-won truth, that the true legacy resides not in material possessions, but in the courage to face the past and the will to build a better future. And as the moon continued its course in the velvet sky, illuminating Harrington Blackwood Estate in a silver light, Eleanor and Maxwell knew they had finally found their place in the world, together, rooted in this land that had seen so many winters and so many springs, and which would now see their love and their common heritage flourish for generations to come.